Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day, Lord. We pray that you would help us in this class think about the problem of evil and your goodness and you being the only possible standard for what is good and right. Help us to communicate this better to others and be more settled in it ourselves. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so you will notice that I do not call this the problem of evil, as you would normally have in a class on apologetics or philosophy of religion. I call it the problem of saying evil. We're told that it's true. It's the most pervasive objection that's brought against the Christian faith. I think there may be a lot of reasons for that, but I think fundamentally the reason is because there actually is a problem of evil in the sense of a pastoral problem. Or we might call it an existential problem. It's a problem because evil's a problem. Evil's not natural. All the effects of evil are not natural. So it is a problem. What we are going to refuse to admit is that it is a philosophical or a logical problem. So I want to maintain just the opposite, that in reality the problem of evil is a devastating problem to skepticism, and one of the more powerful proofs of the Christian faith. Now, that might seem counterintuitive, but just allow me to explain here. Because when we see the logical preconditions, in other words, what must be true in order for our assessment of evil to be true, our ability to identify evil, to be able to say what's so wrong with it, to show all of its attributes, our ability to do that is going to depend on things that the skeptic can't believe in his worldview, things that he has to be committed against. In other words, the problem of saying evil is essentially this. The Christian can say evil, and the skeptic cannot. Not in any objective, meaningful way. We understand that he's saying that. But this is where the Christian apologist has to shift to the conversation. So let me just go over the outline real quick. We're going to start with the basics. What is evil? So we have to understand that in light of good. Then we're going to look at, this is usually the way it's divided into two, the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem. Now, they are not just distinguished in being different things, supposedly, but there's sort of a historical progression as well. During the Enlightenment, the logical problem of evil began to, and it wasn't new, but it began to be pressed against the deists especially. But the problem was, after about a century or two, and certainly by the 20th century, philosophers started to admit that you actually can't show this. And so it started to morph into the evidential problem. Now I'll explain what all that is. And then finally, we're going to wind up in another potential Christian response to it that was popularized by C.S. Lewis and was given more sophistication by Alvin Plantinga and others. But we're going to reject this as a subpar, in fact, I'm going to say, it's unnecessary, it doesn't address the question, and it actually does damage to other areas of Christian doctrine. But we're going to assess that, and I'll show you why. Let's first, before I get to the beginning, the basics, let me just, a little grammar. And this is important. This is not just to give you grammar of a word that might be unfamiliar to you, theodicy. And it just comes from the same word as theology, but in this case, we are, in a sense, speaking for God. It is an explanation. So someone's theodicy is their explanation of the ways of God with evil. But that's being thrown on us in the midst of this and say, okay, well then what morally sufficient justification could possibly exist for this intense instance of suffering or whatever else? And when that happens, you've lost the plot. They never had it, but you've allowed them to shift the burden of proof, which should be on them, to being on you. What's the burden of proof? Can the skeptic meet his burden of proof to demonstrate an actual contradiction between the divine attributes, principally God's goodness, but there's going to be other attributes in view, you'll see, with the evil that exists in the world? They're putting this on us as a burden against the Christian worldview. We're going to say, well, let's back up a step. Can you even define what evil is? Or as the presuppositionalist says, by what standard? And by the way, this is going to be, I'd say, the one area above all in apologetics where the classical view is going to have the most in common with presuppositionalists. So we're going to have a lot of unity here. We'll say it different than the presuppositionalist will, but the reason I'm bringing this up here is to not mix these two things and to always bring it back to this. That's a good question. That's a separate study, and it has to come after. We have to clear this ground first. We have to let the skeptic know that he has no case here. Now we can move on to a Christian explanation for some things that, and I stress some things, that the Bible tells us that God is doing with evil. But of course, we're only going to scratch the surface in this lifetime, and that's part of the point. So let's get to his burden of proof. Good and evil. Very, very crucial that we put all the burden of proof here. We have to understand first that good and evil are not objectively meaningful terms in a non-theistic worldview. For the skeptic, and he's a skeptic of all things metaphysical, all things supernatural, we're dealing with a naturalist. He believes that nature is all there is. When you're dealing with an atheist, he isn't just saying, for all we know, he's saying there is nothing beyond. So he doesn't believe in such things. And for him, as we've seen in a lot of the weeks in various ways, there is no such thing as the way things ought to be. Because there is no otherwise. There is no standard against which you can measure the way things are supposedly falling short in this world. Falling short of what? This world is the only thing that exists. Everything that happens is bound to happen, so on and so forth. We've seen that. So when a skeptic appeals to some standard, he's borrowing from God's law, from God's character, from things that he tells himself cannot exist. So what is evil? And I don't want to be too mysterious here. This is not a hard question, at least not at first, because on a ground level, I think we can all agree, I hope, that evil is not good. When we say the word bad, what do we mean? We mean not good. You say, well, surely that's too simple. No, it's not. It's what you mean. You mean that something is not as it ought to be. The way something is, but of course, in your worldview, everything that is simply is. So you can't make it conform to some other what? Other reality? Some parallel universe? Whatever it is. So let's not make things too difficult. Evil, at least at first, let's go with this, and we could say, well, evil is more than that, its effects, and so forth. Okay, but at root, evil is the opposite of good, that which opposes good. Okay? So very, very important. Now, all sin would fall under this. From a Christian perspective, you may say, well, where's sin? Well, sin is within that. Sin is distinct, but it is certainly at least evil. So what matters for the skeptic here, you say, well, why would I bring that up in an apologetics context? Well, he can't believe in sin. What he's concerned with is what he calls moral evil or personal evil and natural evil. And so that division is often brought up in these contexts, moral evil being what human beings do, either to themselves or to other human beings, things that they are blameworthy for. But then natural evil, things like hurricanes, earthquakes, etc. And then there's sort of a hybrid category where you could put things like war and poverty, things that are, you could say, are human-caused, nevertheless they have natural fallout, things like that. So you'll see different breakdowns, and oftentimes when the breakdown becomes more and more and more complex, what do? We get distracted from the actual root of the problem. We need to bring things back to, which is getting a suitable definition of evil to begin with. So the Christian is at a definite advantage already. One theistic philosopher, Christian philosopher, Terence Penelham, writes this. He says, theists do not see fewer evils in the world than atheists. They see more. Now, what's the first reason for that would be the depths of the evil. But even before you get that, again, even when we start explaining this, and it's a good thing to bring up, but you can just start jumping right over this. He adds to that atheists can never be against sin. So this is one central reason why we see more evil than the atheist does. For to atheists, he says, there can be no sins, sin being a theological concept that only has application if God exists. That's a good point to alert us that we're going to be more sensitive to evil, actually, than the atheist. However, in the very process of saying that, you could be giving more ground and allowing that wiggle room again and getting away from the root problem, because I would argue that for the atheist, evil is in the same boat as sin. It's not just that he can't believe in sin and doesn't care about it, for the same reasons. So what is sin? How is that measured against? What does it fail to conform to? On that score, it's going to suffer the same problem as evil for an atheist. If you don't believe in a reference point, that's the real problem. Same applications then when someone makes moral judgments against God. And we just looked at this moral argument for God's existence. You could be having a conversation with somebody just about public morality and saying, well, what's your standard for that? So you're at a kind of advantage when you've been in the middle of those conversations to say, okay, if they need a basis for that, if all of us need an objective basis to say that that's good and that's evil, well, then why would it be any different if we're going to bring a moral charge against God? We would be saying, in effect, that God, your God, here I'm an atheist saying it, your God in your book fails to conform to what? What is this thing that he's failing to conform to? So I have a little chart here. If those are too small, I'll say them. This one Aiden, you definitely want to have this one directly on the screen because those are small words. But here's the purpose of this one. In order for God to be wrong, think about this for a second. In order for him to be wrong, to have caused any such evil, to have ordained such a reality in its whole or its part, if you want to blame him for any of it, there has to be a right or moral principle that his act is falling short of. But the question becomes, what is sufficient to function as such a principle of right? So let me offer 4 qualities, 4 things at least, that would have to be true about such a principle. So I'm trying to help you out, Mr. Atheist. I'm trying to give you, here's what you're going to need, your building blocks for your view if God is to have fallen short of some moral principle. This principle would have to be real, first of all, right? That's not controversial. In other words, this moral object, whatever it is, maybe it's an alternative reality in which things are morally perfect so as to function as a standard for the way things ought to be. Maybe some kind of ideal. Maybe say, well, I don't want to believe in an alternative reality because I'm not even sure why, but it doesn't sound very tough-minded, which I'm pretending to be right now. Maybe it's then like a mathematical equation, something theoretical, which takes a theorist, but it better be real. Let's start with that. It has to be objective. In other words, it has to actually be right. It has to be an actual moral criteria that stands outside of any finite mind or finite perspective. In other words, it has to hold, thirdly, transcendently, it has to hold over all moral actors at all times, in all places, including God. Because remember, God in this view is the one who's falling short in some way for the creation that he's made or some particular instance of evil. This standard would have to stand over him. It would have to have certain attributes of God, and therefore it would have to be, this is becoming a problem, and you'd have to at least know it. It had to be accessible to our minds in some way in order for us to make the case, especially to other minds, that God is falling short of it. Now, what have we seen already in some of the other weeks? Whatever this thing is would have to be eternal. It'd have to always be there. It'd have to be infinite. It would have to be not subject to change. In other words, it would have to have a lot of the attributes of God. Now, that's certainly a problem. It would have to be there before him in some way. And you might be thinking of this again and saying, well, the atheist doesn't believe in this him that you're referring to. True, but remember, I would say revisit week 4 on atheism, because he is starting from a premise of this kind of a being would have to be, so those are just some bare minimum things that an atheist or a skeptic is going to need in order to have a moral criteria that stands above God. There's Hume. You like well, I didn't draw it, but I got it from the internet. There's David Hume, and these scales are showing us long before David Hume in the ancient world, Roman atheistic philosopher Lucretius already came up with this. So it's not new in the modern world, but he's reviving this idea in his dialogues concerning natural religion. And what you see there are those attributes. You might recall when we talked about logical atheology. This is also week 4, I believe, when we talk about atheism. And logical atheology is so called because it is all of the logical arguments against God. In other words, these are reasons to believe that God cannot exist necessarily. Why? Well, there's 2 basic divisions. One was God versus God atheology. Some attribute of God and some other attribute or set of attributes did not cohere. They violated themselves. Or there's also God versus world atheology. And you might remember from that week I said, wait for it, the biggest example of this is the problem of evil. God versus world atheology is saying that some attribute of God or collection of attributes and some attribute in the world, in this case evil, contradicts. So the logical argument has to say that these actually contradict each other. And so the idea of God, in this case God and the world, is incoherent. So we want to watch the scales here to see whether or not this actually is going to tip against Hume or others who have made the argument. Let me summarize it concisely. And here Hume is almost quoting verbatim Lucretius. He says this: is God willing to prevent evil? Sorry, there it is. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Let me stop there. That's true. I find no fault with the first premise. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. And there's most of what we talk about is going to be drilling at that second premise and saying, nah, you're light years away from being able to show this. In fact, you can't. But we'll see that. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil? So notice, again, the scales. Notice the coexistence of divine omnipotence and divine omniscience and divine omnibenevolence or goodness. So it's not just good versus evil. Because as I'm going to show you in a second, when that doesn't float, because the atheist needs good to make his case, he's going to bring in other attributes, and a bit like a shell game, I guess you could say. He's going to bring in what an omniscient and especially omnipotent being could do, and therefore, because of goodness, now he's going to bring it back around and hope you forgot about the contradiction, would do. So think of the shell game going on the scale. I know I'm mixing metaphors there, but I like doing that. So before we draw out the implications there, just remember what we said, that this is a logical argument. It is an attempt to show that these cannot be. It's not an evidential argument. We'll get to it's not likely, it makes me feel, or, yeah, but what greater good could he possibly? We're going to get to all that. This argument's making a stronger commitment by saying these things are like that square circle or the married bachelor. They are a contradiction in terms. That's what they're claiming. That's quite a claim. So let's evaluate the argument for its validity and its soundness. And this time we'll bring in J.L. Mackie, who I've mentioned before, but a 20th century atheist, who's really just regurgitating, as most modern atheism is, a regurgitation of this or that part of Hume's writings. But Mackie puts it concisely. He says, in its simplest form, the problem is this: God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. There seems to be some contradiction between these three propositions, so that if any two of them were true, the third would be false. Again, clearly, God versus world sort of a claim. Now, how do we directly attack this without wasting any time? Remember, there's a shell game going on, so I could start at any one of those cups. And I think maybe in a lot of these books that are written, maybe just to justify the publishing house publishing more books, let's not waste any time. Let's go right to good and evil first. And we'll bring in the other ones. But let's just consider this. I guess I can leave that up there for now. If it is logically impossible that good, so that's the third of his, well, it doesn't even matter what order he puts it in. If it's logically impossible that good and evil, so we're going to leave aside omniscience and omnipotence for a bit. If it's logically impossible that good and evil could coexist at all in any sense, then either good or evil would not exist. Now, at this point, you might say, well, hold on, that's convenient. You just ruled out the rest of the shell game, as you call it, and then you're isolating good and evil, but they're not isolating good and evil. You're already setting up a straw man. What are you doing, Matt? Bear with me. I'm going to allow their other cups back in. I just want to show you something about good and evil, and then we'll work our way out to those other attributes. If it's logically impossible that good and evil could coexist at all in any sense, then it follows that either good or evil would not exist. Agree so far? If the two could not coexist, then either one or the other would not. Okay, and again, a lot of people might be getting impatient saying, well, why would you do that if they're claiming a little bit more than that? Okay, we're going to see that as we go on. I'm going to skip a page or two in my notes because there's two different ways I say it, and I don't want to say it the first way because I just want, for time's sake. Because again, I'm not finding fault with the premise from 2 slides ago. I'm not finding fault with the first premise. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent, okay? I mean, that's just analytically true. That's like saying that if God is not able to do something, then there's some real power that he lacks. Well, yeah, but that's going to be completely irrelevant. Why? And here's the first reason I'm isolating. The Christian claims, and especially a Reformed Christian, who can more confidently say this, that stopping all evil on contact or before it existed was not, in fact, God's will. We are actually not embarrassed to say that in some way, now if you're interested, Mr. Atheist, as theologians, we actually distinguish between different senses of God's will. Now, you may not be interested in that. I'm only pointing this out to other Christian apologists to say there's a great advantage in doing theology and in allowing your theology to help you out here. We are actually not embarrassed to say that God was willing that evil exist. He ordained it. We are not apologizing for that. So that's going to start to neutralize that first premise anyway. It's why we actually don't care about it. We're not bothered by it in the slightest bit. So that brings us to the real battleground of the argument, which is the second premise. Is he able but not willing? So that's the first reason to take omnipotence to the side. It's actually irrelevant if you are a consistent Reformed Christian. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Here's where the claim is really made. What they're saying is a perfectly good God would be so willing to eliminate evil. Now, notice they are not just setting up some question to us in the form of a question mark and saying, ooh, what do you do about that? Ooh, you've never thought about this? He's actually making a claim, which means the burden of proof is on him to justify his claim. Again, the claim is a perfectly good God would be willing to eliminate evil. He would not be able to stand it. He wouldn't know what to do with it. It would bother God in any relevant sense that evil exists. Okay, right there, that's a lot of information about God for somebody who doesn't believe in God. That's number one. But we reject that as not part of the idea of the Christian God. So let's watch this unravel just a little bit. And I want to ask Hume, and I think I'm one slide behind. I am. Here we are. The logical problem unravels here. Which evil is Hume? I'm going to use Hume as my whipping boy here. This is just the atheist in general, but he's the guy. God would be willing, if he is perfectly good, to eliminate all evil. First question. I'm just going to go really slow, help you out, and you tell me what you mean. Which evil do you mean? Do you mean concrete evil? In other words, real evil that actually exists in the world? Or do you mean only abstract evil? The idea of evil, general evil? Do you mean in particular instances? Do you mean all evil or only some evil? Do you mean present evil? Do you mean he would eliminate it finally? Do you mean he would eliminate it absolutely so that no evil could ever have come into existence? And I have to ask, if you're going along this path, why wouldn't it just be the last one? I mean, why stop short? Why not say that he would eliminate all such evil, which is kind of how their objection is. It's weighted that way. It depends on that. Well, let's tease that out a little bit and see if we can do some process of elimination. And I call this first problem the per se problem. I've already hinted at it, but let me just hammer it home. Suppose what he means is that good per se cannot exist with evil per se. What if that's what he means? Well, consider that if it is logically impossible that good and evil could coexist at any time in any sense, I realize I said this already, I want to hammer it home, then either good or evil would not exist. But if evil does not exist, now I'm just going to draw the conclusion. If evil does not exist, well, then there's no problem of evil. So there goes his argument on one side. But if good does not exist, then there's no standard by which to call something evil. So that evil falls once again on the other side. Consequently, the thesis that good and evil cannot coexist per se in any sense is illogical. Now, of course, he's going to say, okay, great, but I'm not saying that. I'm saying about a personal being. A personal being cannot coexist with well, then I would jump in quickly, then Hume can't exist because he's at least a personal being that is capable of condemning evil by some good standard. Of course, he's going to jump in against it. No, I'm not saying just any old personal being, but a personal being such as your God, who is both perfectly good and who has all of the power, has all the wherewithal to do more than condemn evil, but to solve evil. Well, that's not going to escape the problem. I'll come back to this picture. Mackey puts it again in these terms. He's going to give you a standard. That good is opposed to evil in such a way that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, and that there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. Again, we agree that there's no limits in real things that an omnipotent thing can do, but he's loading into that something else. From these, it follows that a good, omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely. But what's key right now, I'll pick on this in a second. What's key right now is eliminating evil completely means all evil. If they're consistent, it's an absolute destruction of evil. The very idea of it cannot coexist with such a good being. So I'm going to call this the on-contact problem. Killing evil on contact. This difficulty, when you think, well, that's silly. No, but the atheist isn't saying that. He's saying more than that. True. But that problem is actually not going to go away. His argument actually still depends on this, even when he starts adding the other cups in the shell game. Here's why. If the whole essence of such a being is that he would destroy evil per se, you might say destroy it on contact, this has to include each case of evil in every instant. Why not? Whether past, present, or future. The very thought of it. Why allow the slightest entertainment of evil? If good and evil cannot coexist in principle, no exception can be made in theory, extent, or stage of development. But in this case, such a being will need to know two things. And again, in this case, it's not Hume. It's his projection of God as he sees it. Such a being that he thinks Christians believe in would have to know two things. He'll need to be able to identify evil in order to eliminate it. Therefore, he'll need to know what evil is. Therefore, he'll have to know what good is. So you're right back to the original problem. He will also need to know all locations or sources of such evil in order to oppose it in each particular case. If such a being must do this of necessity, it follows that it must do so instantaneously. Now, I'm going to allow him to say, no, he wouldn't have to do it instantaneously. He wouldn't have to do it in each instance. It's only when it gathers enough problems and so on, and that's going to create the opposite problem. But recall so far that the logical argument demands that one of these attributes cannot coexist with the other in principle. That's what a logical problem is. If such a being did this, eliminated it in each and every case, and it would seem that evil could never exist in any form at any point, even in his mind. Evil would be a logical impossibility, and no mind, not even an all-knowing mind, could attribute anything to it. It would be a meaningless combination of words like those square circles. Now, of course, the skeptic doesn't believe that either. He does believe in evil. He does have a standard, and he's going to try to revive a kind of standard. But he's going to say this. He's going to have to say, no, he wouldn't have to do this on contact, as you're calling it. Evil can exist at a point. This is the atheist talking now. Now he's going to revive evil. Evil can exist at a point in time or space or his own mind in order to destroy it. But I have to ask the atheist at that point, now what's the difference between your argument and what the Christian is saying? Now you're allowing that evil can exist for a time. And he might say, and he's going to have to say, well, it can exist just until, and here comes some arbitrary standard, when it starts to do real harm. He's not going to say something like, when it offends my sensibilities. He's going to try to put something really tough on us, and that creates what we're going to call the evidential problem of evil. Because the atheist has done enough work with theistic philosophers in the 19th and then eventually in the 20th century, and they've abandoned the logical problem of evil for the most part. Because they see this problem, they cannot actually make the terms actually necessarily go against each other. They're actually saying something like this, and frankly, this works to their advantage anyway, because the whole reason the problem of evil has the sting that it does is because it has the sting that it does. It's not, the problem isn't a logical equation. The problem is that every single one of us is hurting. I was in the middle of this conversation one time at a downtown in Boise doing campus ministry, and there were two guys, one of which I had worked with in the past. I knew him, and he was an unbeliever, but he came from a Christian house, so he knew some of these things already. But he brought an atheist friend with him, and I'm having a lot of success. I'm making them think. And then some Christian buds in and says things like, and one thing in particular, and he's not alone in this, yeah, but you can't say that to somebody on their deathbed. What was he saying? You can't say something too powerful, too right, too absolutely smoking the entire landscape and showing they're hurting. To which I responded, of course. There's a couple things you could say to them at that point. One is, this person's not on their deathbed. What's happening here with the shift to the evidential problem of evil is that the whole argument starts to then change the subject, to play on our heartstrings and to talk about things that are real, where the problem really is, but they're cheating. They're not coming to you as some blind beggar on the streets of Calcutta, missing limbs. They're coming to you as an arrogant Western philosopher or a student of philosophy. And when things start to not go their way, much like a tyrant in war starts to hide behind human shields, they start to hide behind real things that we all ought to care about and shudder at. And this should be a part of the discussion as long as you understand that your argument's changing. And by the way, here's another reason why it matters. This argument will still be smuggling in logic. It's still going to depend on a bunch of things that they're saying that this cannot be the case, that God exists. Sorry, let me just develop this idea a little bit. Because what they're really saying here in exasperation is, but the world is filled with evil, filled with suffering, and it seems inconsistent with a good God. So now you're not saying this cannot go with this. Now you're saying, I can't see something. And I agree, you can't. And by the way, I can't either. But that's why I showed you that slide at the beginning. Now you're talking about theodicy and not the problem of evil. Okay, but this represents the shift from logic to evidence. And with it, the beginning of the shift from tough-minded skepticism to hiding behind the existential dimensions of pain and suffering. At first, it seems, and that's why it's called this, you're moving to an inductive argument, to particular concrete instances, and then you're wrestling, you're saying, I can't see what God, and in the process, you have to be able to catch this, they're changing the subject now. They're no longer talking about the Christian's burden to unravel this, and now they're putting on the Christian some burden to explain it, which is a good question if you're honest that that's where you're at, but it never is the case. So what's meant by evidence here in this particular instance? What they're really saying is this. They're making another claim. What morally sufficient reason would God have for ordaining X instance? And you'll just hear me say X to stand for any amount. And it'll have to do with the scope of the suffering, the extent of the suffering, maybe over time, the intensity of the suffering, the senselessness of the suffering, and under that sometimes then it'll be the weakest. So nobody says that Hitler suffering in the bunker is senseless, or some mass murderer in court, he's going to jail, he's going to suffer in jail, but nobody uses that example because you see that as a portion of justice. Instead, you're going to point to child suffering, or maybe animal suffering is used as examples of this. What are you doing? You're reaching down into the things that it would be obscene for us to answer. Why would it be obscene? The other thing I told that person, by the way, is, you know what's really heartless? Is giving someone a version of Christianity in which God always blesses us, or in which there's no suffering to expect in this world, and then they don't have a theology of suffering until the suffering hits. Okay, that's actually what's really heartless, if you want to know what's heartless here. But we're having these conversations, hopefully, either long after when we're reflecting, or hopefully, preferably before there's been suffering. Well, in examining how the argument progresses, because Hume does go here in his dialogues, one 20th century philosopher, doesn't appear to be a Christian on this particular thing, but a guy named Nelson Pike, he finds a lot of these arguments unconvincing. And he shows this by means of an analogy to a parent administering bitter medicine to a sick child. And this is a typical analogy. And he concludes that when we are assured that a parent acted in the child's health and happiness, the fact that he knowingly caused discomfort, bad medicine, discomfort, there's actually surgeries that are painful, but why do you do them? Because they prevent. So you could put a doctor into this analogy too, not just a parent. When we're assured of that, the fact that he knowingly caused discomfort is not sufficient to remove the parent from the class of perfectly good beings. Big sigh of relief there whenever I read things like that, the way philosophers talk about it. That example might seem trivial, but actually all it's meant to do at first is to rule out one criteria in order to focus on others. In other words, suffering per se, because we're all agreed here in this conversation that God's causing it, the atheist is just making that as a charge, that we can see many instances in life in which suffering causes growth, causes us to avoid some pitfall or to become worse in ourselves. So the refined question remains, in light of that instance of suffering, whether you're talking about its intensity, its scope, extent, whatever, what greater good could justify it? Again, we have to remind the person that that is an explanation of the ways of God. The Bible does say a lot about that. But again, that you're changing the subject. Okay, the claim can be stated positively. They're not just saying, the last thing I'll say about this, they're not just saying what good cause, or I don't see what reason. They're making a claim. It's an argument after all. The claim is an omnipotent and omniscient being would have no morally sufficient reason for allowing X instance of suffering. It could be translated into the more direct objection to God. X is unjust, or in other words, God is unjust to do or to allow X, whatever it is. Now, there's biblical ways to answer this straightforwardly. And we would agree with this. For example, when God says to Job in Job 36, who has prescribed for him his way? Or who can say you have done wrong? You know, there's a Job 36 through 40 answer, and there's a Romans 9 answer, and they're the same answer to all these things, which is basically, who are you, O man? Or in Job, where were you? That's meant theologically, and that is, sit down and shut up. You are not God. And that's true. There is a theological version of that. There's also a philosophical meaning of those objections or those counter-objections by Paul in Romans 9 or God in Job. And it's just literally, who are you, oh man? Where were you, oh man? It's a rhetorical way of God saying, you weren't there. He could transfer that positively. In other words, you don't have adequate information to judge on this question, to fill out your premises. It's meaningless from your perspective. And you can't turn around and say, it's meaningless, therefore it means you messed up. No, meaningless means no meaning. And your premises are full of meaning. There's a C.S. Lewis quote that I meant to put in this week, and I forgot to put it in there, but it comes from Mere Christianity. And it's in the same context where he's making that moral argument for God's existence. And he was recalling the time that he was an atheist, and he said, well, if a good God made the world and it's gone wrong, why blah, 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 blah? And Lewis stopped himself and he said, and then it never occurred to me, where had I got this idea of just and unjust? If the whole universe was meaningless, and therefore it didn't have any justice to it, well, I would never have come to notice it. It would be like being a creature with no eyes. Dark would be without meaning. And so Lewis says, I was forced to admit that this universe was filled with meaning, including my sense of justice, that it was not just a private fancy of my own, but that there's many things in this universe that are unjust. So what accounts for that? And Lewis concludes that consequently atheism is too simple. And that's exactly right. So this is a logical argument still, being smuggled in to all the suffering and pain, which you're now being distracted toward, very understandably. If he's going to make good on his claim that there is no morally sufficient reason, it's another one of my lists, he's going to need 5 things. He's going to need to know at bare minimum these 5 things. He's going to need the whole set of reasons or ends which could be used to justify all possible instances of evil. He's already out, right? He needs to know. If he says there's no reasons, he has to know all the available or possible reasons in order to evaluate them and say, no, that doesn't measure up. Secondly, he's going to need to know all possible means to those ends. There may be an infinite, as far as he knows, amount of means that could achieve those ends. Thirdly, he's going to need to know all possible outcomes of those means. In other words, whether or not the ends could be achieved. He's going to have to assess the power of God in order to achieve those particular ends. He's out again. Fourthly, he's going to need to know all of the best combinations of means to ends. And finally, there's that necessary condition we've already covered. He's going to need to have that self-sufficient, eternal, and immutable moral criterion to judge 1 through 4. And especially when we're already up here, the things which justify any of God's ways, he has to know the whole set of them in order to assess whether or not they actually measure up to what. He still has that problem. To cut right to the chase, the one thing we lack in order to make the argument float is precisely omniscience. Omniscience will have to exist for God to not exist on account of evil. And that's pretty anticlimactic for someone who's trying to disprove or at least cast major shade on the possibility or the probability of such a being existing. Now, Pike, who I mentioned, seems to grant this point. He's assessing Hume's dialogues. Don't worry about the names. In Hume's dialogue, there's 3 characters, and one represents an evidentialist, Cleanthes, one represents sort of a religious rationalist, and another sort of a fideist, but you can tell he's a skeptic, and he's kind of arguing for Hume's position. But so it doesn't matter who they are. He's casting it on the person making the argument. He says, Philo, this guy making this claim, there could be no sufficient reasons, could never claim to have examined all the possibilities. And at any given point in the argument, Cleanthes could always claim that God's reasons for permitting suffering is one which Philo had not yet considered. A retreat to unexamined reasons would remain open to Cleanthes, regardless of how complete the list of examined reasons seems to be. It's pathetic for a philosopher of religion to recognize this much and still use the language of he could retreat into, as if it's still our burden, but we still have these cards to play. No, the problem is much worse for you, Mr. Skeptic. It's not just that we're retreating and there's these possibilities, these other doors, these other windows. It's that you can't operate in any of them, that none of the cards are yours. You need to know something that you reject existing. You're the problem. You're the one who can't account for this. So the retreat. So even when he's seeing this, they still speak in that language. He says the problem of evil can only be the problem of discovering a specific theodicy, and that's what I was saying. He's saying this is over if you're an atheist, and he's an atheist saying this. So the problem now shifts here to be the problem of discovering a specific theodicy which is adequate, that is, of discovering which, if any, of the specific proposals which might be advanced really describes God's morally sufficient reason for allowing instances of suffering. I might ask this all in a different way. Suppose that God did have perfectly good reasons to allow or to ordain all the evil that he did. How probable is it that he should confide in you or me as to what even a fraction of those reasons are? Now, as it is, as Christians, we have in the Bible quite a lot of what he's doing, but why should that be expected to begin with? Much less all of God's reasons or his deepest reasons. Why should we expect that? By what standard? I'll agree with the presuppositionalist in using that. Last point, real quick, the failure of the free will defense. Now, again, this is popularized by C.S. Lewis in The Problem of Pain. I've highlighted Lewis a lot in his contribution to natural theology. I'm not going to speak as well of him here. There's valuable truths in that book, but the elements that made this argument are fundamentally flawed. He begins with the premises that free will is at least necessary for creatures who are self-conscious, who are placed in a world with other selves. Some common field has to exist, some fixed resources, such that, secondly, the exercise of the will is what constitutes a life that makes all of the virtues worth living. Love, or when I run into other wills with this fixed nature, these become the occasions for me exercising mercy, patience, courage, etc. Well, that's true. It does become the occasion for that. But what's he doing? Lewis says this: we can perhaps conceive of a world in which God corrected the results of this abuse of free will. So stop right there. The first thing he's doing is answering the skeptic by saying, well, free will. It's like, how did evil get into the world to begin with? Well, Adam's free will. Okay, Adam did exercise his free will, and that's the avenue in which it took place, but you totally didn't answer my question. I'm asking about the origin of it, or the blameworthiness of it, and you haven't touched either of those. But he starts there and says, we can conceive of a world in which God corrected the results of this abuse of free will by his creatures at every moment, so that a wooden beam became soft as grass when it was used as a weapon, and the air refused to obey me if I attempted to set up in it the sound waves that carry lies and insults. But such a world would be one in which wrong actions were impossible, and in which, therefore, the freedom of the will would be void. You see, if you switch the order of that sentence, you see the assumption there. If freedom of the will, therefore evil must exist. Okay, there's one bad assumption, there's others. Try to exclude the possibility of suffering, which the order of nature and the existence of free wills involve, and you find that you have excluded life itself. Okay? Now, Planting is going to say the same thing with more sophistication. Technicality, maybe is a better word. But it's going to be the same. He begins the same way. He offers some steps. He said, first of all, not even an omnipotent being could both give free will and withhold it. Lewis and Planting are saying the same thing. Okay, I agree with that. That would be contradictory. Okay. Second, free will necessitates, not only does it make life worth living in those ways, but he calls it transworld depravity. What's that? Well, it is in any possible world where free will exists, the inevitability that sin should exist follows. Was that true of God? Like if he didn't create anything else, would it be true of God's reality? Well, no, not that one. Okay, is that not an impossible world? Okay, there's your first problem. There's others that follow. But first, let's finish his argument. Such a world was worth the trade-off. Now, I'm shortening that a lot. But God believed that that was worth the... And they don't want to use words like gamble, because Lewis in his other writings would argue against what we today call open theism in various ways. So you wouldn't want to use gamble, although Lewis in one of his books uses the word risk about God. Apparently God thought this worth the risk. Aha. For Plantinga, this is not a theodicy, but a defense sufficient to show the atheist's claim to contradiction is unnecessary. So he at least does make that separation, and that's all nice. But you notice that he makes the argument depend on this idea of free will, that in order for a will to be free, well, I'll just use Plantinga's own words in his book on evil. He said, what is relevant to the free will defense is the idea that being free with respect to an action. Now he gives you a standard. This is what I mean by free will. If a person is free with respect to a given action, then he is free to perform that action and free to refrain from performing it. Now, stop right there. I agree with that. A free will is one that's free to perform it and free to refrain from performing the same action. Okay, I agree with that. Watch what he does in the next breath. This is a continuous thought. He's unpacking the same idea. In other words, no antecedent conditions and or causal laws determine that he will perform the action or that he won't. Stop. By the way, this is what's called libertarian free will. And we reject that. We would believe in compatibilistic free will. What's the difference? When he says that a free choice is one that can either choose this or choose otherwise, you're like, okay, tracking with you. Self-determination, I'm the one choosing. I'm not being coerced. That's what most people mean by freedom. I'll buy that. Meaning, he's going to smuggle something in. No antecedent conditions and or causal laws determining that he will perform one or the other. Okay, so here's me. Here's choice, lifting this, versus option B, not choosing to lift it. I can do this, and nobody's forcing me to do it. That's what I mean by freedom. Okay, I agree with you. He adds, nothing in me, you see, he doesn't make... I agree that nothing outside of me, a guy with a gun to my head, I'm under duress, my freedom is limited to that extent. I agree if he's saying that. He's not. He's saying more than that. Not just somebody with a gun to your head or something outside of you. No antecedent condition includes no antecedent condition in you. No causal laws determining includes no causal laws in you. In other words, what they're saying is this. This is foundational, by the way, to the difference between Arminianism and Calvinism, is they're defining free will to mean your own nature cannot be naturally inclined to one thing or another, or else it's not free. That would be determinism. False. And this idea gets a lot of mileage in a lot of different... But here, he's saying it functions in the free will defense. So here's another strike against the free will defense, is its notion of free will is completely nonsense. They say, well, why would you even care? Lastly, Mackey, an atheist, even sees this. He says, why could God, and he's responding to people like Plantinga, why could God not have made men such, I'll just read it from here, my eyes are bad, such that they always freely choose the good? That's a good question. He said freely choose, because they would be automatons. You haven't proven that yet. God is perfectly free, and he always chooses the good. Are you saying he's less free? Come back to that. Mackey says, if there is no logical impossibility in a man's freely choosing the good in one or on several occasions, There cannot be a logical impossibility in his freely choosing the good on every occasion. I agree with Mackey, the atheist, against planning of the theist. I agree. That's a good point. Why does this matter for the Christian? Two doctrines go down the tubes if you embrace this idea of free will, libertarian free will. One, I already hinted, the doctrine of God. Is God a less morally significant being than one of his creatures? Is he less free than one of his creatures because it would be impossible for him to choose evil for various reasons that we could unpack? Here's another problem. The eternal state. What is the power that will cause us to never fall from God? Is it something in our will that just keeps performing? So you can see the idea. This creates problems. How you do apologetics sometimes can start to unravel even your own beliefs. Sorry, questions or comments? We got 2 minutes. We're good. Oh, that was just a repeat slide, although I think I might have drawn out the third. I already did that with planning it, so that's just kind of a repeat slide. Yeah. I would just say that argument is unnecessary, avoids the question, ruins Christian theology. That's 3 strikes. So in baseball, you'd be out. I don't recommend it. But any other buzzer beaters? Yep.
Just a comment. You mentioned that a lot of their thought process is very simplistic when it concerns evil and good.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that, I don't know if they ever consider the thought that that God can work evil for good.
Right. Right, and that goes into the one of the 5 conditions there. Is that a contradiction for him to use evil? That we do that. We just said the doctor with the medicine or the parent or whatever else. We have analogies even in this life where we do that. And you're saying God can't do that? How's that work? So yeah, that's a problem. Yep.
Also, on the idea of suffering, they seem to immediately go to God. How can God permit suffering?
Right.
In this very simple form of it.
Yeah.
And they overlook, conveniently, that most of the greatest part of the suffering in this world is caused by other men.
Yeah, sinners and sin. And, they think that's trite or whatever else. I would ask them, what have you done to alleviate some of that suffering versus how much you've caused? What do you think your balance sheet would be there? But all of this then belongs to theodicy, which, by the way, that's worth doing a whole, 12-week class. So not to shortchange that at all, but I just want to keep that separate from the problem of evil. Those are good questions if someone's really asking and willing to be humble and hear the Bible out on what God is up to. But in this context, we just have to distinguish it and say, the burden of proof is on you first. Okay, let me close. Before I do, let me just say this is the last one on apologetics. Now, if you're keeping score, I just covered philosophical apologetics. I didn't get to the evidential stuff. Science, the resurrection, scripture, prophecies about Jesus, comparison to Islam. True. So what I've done, where I've come to in my mind, is that, so this is like part 1, 12 weeks of philosophical apologetics. Part 2, Lord willing, whenever that happens, which I'm just going to take the season off for various reasons, is evidential apologetics. Next week, I'm starting a new class. I'm at a busy season coming up, and the only way I can do it with excellence is to do book studies similar to like Machen and the Watson one we did, and I'm going to be doing one on Stephen Charnock's Existence and Attributes of God. So it's basically a Doctrine of God class, and Charnock is a classic Puritan, great thinker, and it'll last for at least 14 weeks because there's 14 discourses. So that's where I'm going. Let me pray. Father, we thank you for all of your grace and your just dealings and your good and perfect ends, which we can only scratch the surface of. But Lord, you have been faithful, trustworthy, and good to us, good to your people, and in fact, as we'll see in the service today, good to the whole world. Even in the midst of judgment, you give us much undeserved grace. We thank you for this. We thank you for this study. I pray it would bear much fruit. In Jesus' name.